The horizon is still black. Not the black of ink, but the deep, uncertain black of the Pacific before dawn, where the ocean and sky blur into one vast, breathing void. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of human sight, a Japanese reconnaissance pilot is flying his patrol route. He's done this 100 times. The routine is calming: watch the darkness, scan for silhouettes, report back. Nothing ever changes at this hour. But this morning, something is different. He sees them before he believes them. Tiny pinpoints of light, scattered across the water like fallen stars. Aircraft carriers. Not one. Not two. A dozen. Maybe more. His hands tighten on the controls. He counts again. Radio's back. The voice on the other end asks him to repeat. He does. There's a long pause. Then, confirm your position. He's exactly where he's supposed to be. The Japanese staff officers receiving the report don't understand. This isn't possible. The Americans, those Americans, the ones who stumbled at Wake Island, who bled at Coral Sea, who barely held Midway, they don't operate like this. They can't. Naval aviation doesn't work this way. You don't just appear. Not in these numbers. Not in the dark. But this is not 1942 anymore. The Imperial Navy had built its doctrine on a very particular idea, that America was big, yes, but slow. That its industrial power was vast, yes, but distant. That when provoked, it would need months to mobilize, weeks to position, and hours, precious, exploitable hours, to launch. That idea had died somewhere between Pearl Harbor and this moment. It died quietly, in the workshops of Detroit and the shipyards of Newport News. It died in the hands of deck crews who learned to fuel a Hellcat in 3 minutes instead of 10. It died when American engineers stopped asking how do we build more planes, and started asking how do we launch them faster. The reconnaissance pilot banks hard and heads for home. His radio crackles with more sighting reports. Other scouts are seeing the same thing. The numbers keep climbing. 40 carriers. 50. The officers on the receiving end are now silent. They're doing the math. If each carrier holds 60 planes, and if even half of them launch. The sun hasn't risen yet. But the sky is about to catch fire. For years, the Japanese naval staff had operated under a comforting assumption. It wasn't arrogance, exactly, it was doctrine. It was written into their training manuals, rehearsed in their war games, baked into every operational plan. American aviation is reactive, not proactive. It needs time. This wasn't baseless. Early in the war, it had been true. American carrier groups in 1942 struggled to coordinate even modest strike packages. Launching 30 planes could take an hour. Arming them, fueling them, positioning them on deck, it was a bottleneck operation, and the Japanese knew it. Their own fleet had exploited that weakness at every turn. Hit first. Hit hard. Disappear before the Americans could get their lumbering air wings off the deck. Japanese fighter pilots trained under this rhythm. The enemy would always be late. Always one step behind. You could afford to press an attack, to linger over a target, because you knew that by the time American planes arrived, you'd already be halfway home. But somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, that rhythm broke. It happened slowly at first. A carrier group that launched faster than expected. A strike that arrived 15 minutes early. Japanese intelligence officers noted the discrepancies but chalked them up to luck, or perhaps desperation. The Americans were learning. That was fine. They'd still be slow. They'd still need daylight. They'd still need logistical overhead, fuel trucks, ammo trains, maintenance crews working in sequence, one plane at a time. Except that's not what was happening. What the Japanese didn't see, what they couldn't see from their side of the ocean, was the revolution taking place on American flight decks. The US Navy had done something unprecedented. It had taken the assembly line and put it to sea. Not metaphorically. Literally. Deck crews were no longer just sailors who happened to work on planes. They were industrial workers. Timed. Synchronized. Drilled to the point where every movement was muscle memory, every task a step in a relentless, repeating sequence. The myth of slow America. Henry Ford never set foot on an aircraft carrier. But his fingerprints were everywhere. In 1913, Ford had revolutionized manufacturing with a single, brutal insight: if you break a task into small, repeatable steps, and if you assign each step to a specialized worker, you can build a car in hours instead of days. The assembly line wasn't just faster, it was relentless. It didn't tire. It didn't hesitate. It turned complexity into rhythm. 30 years later, the US Navy was doing the same thing to war. Before 1943, launching aircraft from a carrier was chaos dressed up as procedure. Planes had to be pulled from the hangar, positioned on deck, fueled from hoses dragged across the flight line, armed with bombs or torpedoes hauled up from magazines, checked by mechanics, pre-flighted by pilots, all while other planes were landing, or taxiing, or waiting. It was a choreography problem with no choreographer. Every launch was a negotiation between time, space, and physics. Then someone asked a very Detroit question: what if we stopped thinking about planes and started thinking about production units? The transformation was surgical. Ammunition crews became cells, like stations on a Model T line. One team did nothing but fuel. Another did nothing but arm. A third handled engine checks. A fourth managed taxi routes. Every role was timed, practiced, and perfected until the motion became automatic. A Hellcat could roll onto the deck, get fueled, armed, and launched in under 4 minutes. For minutes. The Japanese, at their absolute best, needed 12. But it wasn't just speed. It was capacity. Ford had proven that if you standardize the process, you can scale infinitely. The same principle applied to carriers. By mid-1944, the US Navy wasn't launching planes one at a time. It was launching them in waves, coordinated surges where dozens of aircraft lifted off in rapid succession, one every 30 seconds, like product rolling off a factory floor. Ordnance men stopped thinking about loading this bomb onto this plane. They thought about throughput. How many tons per hour? How many sorties per sunrise? Electricians didn't troubleshoot individual engines, they triaged, swapping out faulty units and sending planes back into rotation. Fuel teams measured their work not in gallons pumped, but in minutes saved. Just-in-time inventory control, a concept Japan would later pioneer in the 1970s, was already happening on American carriers in 1944. Bombs were staged near the elevators. Fuel hoses were pre-positioned. Maintenance tools were cached at every corner of the deck. Nothing was wasted. No motion was redundant. The Japanese had built their carriers around the philosophy of the ace, the skilled pilot, the individual warrior, the man who could turn the tide of a battle through sheer ability. America built its carriers around the philosophy of the factory. The pilot didn't matter as much as the system. And the system could produce 50 planes in the time it took Japan to produce 10. Fordism had come to see. And it brought a fury the world had never seen. They called it Task Force 38. Later, it was redesignated Task Force 58. The number didn't matter. What mattered was what it represented: the largest concentration of naval airpower in human history. Not a fleet. Not even a battle group. A flying continent. At its heart stood men like Mark Mitcher and Raymond Spruance, admirals who understood that the war had changed. Mitcher was slight, soft-spoken, and perpetually sunburned. He wore a battered cap and rarely raised his voice. But under his command, the Pacific Fleet's carriers stopped behaving like individual ships and started behaving like a single organism. A hive mind, coordinated across hundreds of miles of ocean, capable of generating airpower on a scale that defied comprehension. By the summer of 1944, a single American task force could launch more planes in a morning than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy had sent to Pearl Harbor. Let that settle for a moment. Pearl Harbor, the raid that stunned the world, that pulled America into the war, that represented the absolute zenith of Japanese carrier doctrine, had involved 353 aircraft. It was considered an overwhelming force, a masterstroke of planning and execution. In 1944, the U.S. Navy could launch 500 planes before the sun cleared the horizon, and then launch 500 more after lunch. The logistics alone should have been impossible. Fuel consumption for a single day of operations could drain a small oil field. Ammunition expenditure could empty an arsenal. Food, water, spare parts, medical supplies, all of it had to be delivered, stored, distributed, and replenished while the fleet was moving. Underway replenishment ships, tankers and supply vessels became as critical as the carriers themselves. They'd pull alongside in open ocean, rig fuel lines and cargo nets, and pump thousands of gallons while both ships steamed at 20 knots. The system worked because it had to. Because the alternative was letting the Japanese catch their breath. When Japanese reconnaissance planes radioed back their sighting reports, the officers receiving them didn't just doubt the numbers, they doubted reality itself. One report claimed 15 carriers in a single formation. Another said 20. The counts kept climbing. Some staff officers suspected the scouts were seeing the same ships twice, mistaking destroyer escorts for carriers, inflating numbers out of panic. But the scouts weren't wrong. The Americans weren't hiding anymore. They didn't need to. Task Force 38 operated in the open ocean like a steel typhoon, daring the Japanese to respond. And when they did, when Japanese planes scrambled to intercept, when their remaining carriers tried to maneuver into position, they were met with a wall of aircraft so dense it blotted out the sky. This wasn't a battle. It was mathematics. Industrial output measured in sorties per hour. Victory calculated not by tactics, but by tempo. The Japanese could still fight. They still had skilled pilots, brave men, capable ships. But they couldn't fight this. Because this wasn't a navy. It was a factory that floated. And it never stopped producing. There's a moment in every war when the numbers stop making sense. When the reports coming in are so far outside the expected range that they stop feeling like intelligence and start feeling like fiction. For the Japanese naval staff, that moment came on a quiet morning in June 1944. The reconnaissance pilot's voice was steady. Too steady. He was reading coordinates, altitudes, bearings, all the technical details that confirmed he wasn't panicking, wasn't guessing. And then he said the number. 600 aircraft inbound. The officer who took the report wrote it down. Stared at it. Asked for confirmation. The pilot repeated. 600. Maybe more. The formations were stacked so deep he couldn't count the upper layers. 600. The problem wasn't disbelief. The problem was that their entire defensive playbook had been written for engagements involving 50 planes. Maybe 100, in the worst case. Every calculation, every tactical doctrine, every prearranged scramble plan assumed that American strikes would come in manageable waves. You'd lose some aircraft, sure. You'd take some hits. But you'd disrupt the attack. Force them to turn back. Buy time. But you can't disrupt 600 planes. You can't intercept them. You can't even track them all. The radar screens, primitive by American standards, couldn't distinguish individual contacts in formations that large. It just looked like a solid mass, a wall of steel and aluminum moving at 200 knots. Japanese officers recalculated. Checked their charts. Ran the numbers again. If the Americans were launching this many planes, they'd have to be stripping their carriers bare. Leaving themselves defenseless. It had to be an all-or-nothing gamble. Except it wasn't. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that the Americans weren't launching everything. This was a routine morning strike. Task Force 38 was holding back reserves. Holding back interceptors for fleet defense. Holding back dive bombers for follow-up strikes in the afternoon. 600 planes wasn't desperation. It was standard operating procedure. The Japanese scrambled what fighters they had. Maybe 80 planes made it into the air. Against 600. The math was so lopsided it barely qualified as combat. American fighters swept them aside like debris. Hellcats and Corsairs, flown by pilots who'd trained in the skies over Nevada and Texas, who'd learned to fly in formation, to communicate, to trust the man on their wing. They didn't dogfight. They didn't duel. They cleared sectors, methodically erasing enemy aircraft from the sky with the same efficiency as a factory floor supervisor checking off items on a production list. The bombers didn't even slow down. Japanese playbooks had always relied on a formula: surprise, shock, overwhelm. Strike first, strike hard, and vanish before the enemy can respond. It had worked at Pearl Harbor. It had worked in the Dutch East Indies. It had worked because the enemy had always needed time. But America had flipped the formula. Now they were the ones delivering surprise. They were the ones overwhelming. And there was no vanishing, because they'd be back tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after that. The war had stopped being a series of battles. It had become a siege. And the siege happened every sunrise. There's a photograph, rarely seen, of a Japanese fighter pilot standing beside his Zero. He's young, maybe 22. His flight suit is immaculate. His posture is formal, reverent. The Zero behind him is polished to a mirror shine, every rivet smoothed, every panel aligned. This isn't just a machine. It's an extension of his spirit, his honor. In the Japanese Naval Air Corps, the bond between pilot and aircraft was almost mystical. You flew the same plane, knew its quirks, respected its limits. You didn't just maintain it, you cared for it. Now picture an American pilot. He's also young. His flight suit has oil stains. He's chewing gum. He doesn't know the name of the plane he's about to fly, because it's not his plane. It's a plane. Serial number stenciled on the fuselage. Interchangeable. If it breaks, he'll fly another. If that one breaks, he'll fly a third. There are always more planes. This difference, this philosophical chasm, defined the air war in the Pacific. Japanese doctrine was built around the ace. The elite pilot who'd trained for years, who'd logged 1,000 hours, who could outmaneuver anyone in a knife fight at 10,000 feet. Soburo Sokai? Hideyoshi Nishizawa. Names that carried weight. Men who could, on a good day, take down 3 or 4 enemies. American doctrine was built around volume. It didn't matter if your pilots were slightly less skilled. It didn't matter if they'd only trained for 6 months instead of 6 years. What mattered was that you had 50 pilots for every one of theirs. And those 50 pilots were flying planes that were faster, tougher, more heavily armed. And when one got shot down, there were 10 more being built in California that same afternoon. The Japanese fought like swordsmen. Every engagement was personal. Every loss was felt. Every victory celebrated. But swordsmen can be exhausted. They can be outnumbered. They can be overwhelmed. Americans fought like a factory. Cold. Efficient. Relentless. There was no romance in it. No honor in the traditional sense. Just mathematics. Sortie rates. Kill ratios. Attrition curves. If you lost 2 planes to destroy 1 enemy airfield, that was a good trade, because you could replace those 2 planes by next week, and the Japanese couldn't replace the airfield at all. The samurai creed valued the warrior's skill. The industrial sword valued the warrior's replaceability. And in a war of attrition, replaceability was everything. By late 1944, Japanese pilots were still brave. Still skilled. Still willing to die. But bravery doesn't refuel your plane. Skill doesn't repair a shattered runway. Willingness to die doesn't matter when the enemy has already moved on to the next target. The sword had met the machine. And the machine had no mercy. The bombs fell like rain. Not metaphorically. Literally. So many bombs, dropped so fast, that from the ground it looked like weather, a dark, metallic storm blotting out the sun. Japanese soldiers on Saipan, Guam, Tinian, and a dozen other islands learned to recognize the sound. First the distant drone of engines. Then the air raid sirens, shrill and useless. Then the whistle. Then the world ending in fire and concussion. But the bombs were only half the strategy. What the mass dawn strikes actually accomplished wasn't just destruction, it was tempo. The Japanese couldn't repair what was being destroyed because the Americans didn't let them. A runway hit at 6 a.m. would be hit again at noon. And again at dusk. Repair crews working in daylight became targets themselves. Fuel depots that survived one raid were obliterated in the next. Supply convoys trying to move under cover of darkness were caught by night fighters equipped with radar. The Japanese doctrine of decisive battle, the idea that you could force one massive engagement, win it, and shift the war's momentum, had evaporated. There was no decisive battle anymore. Just a grinding, hourly erosion. Every morning, the Japanese woke up with fewer planes. Fewer runways. Fewer gallons of avgas. Fewer mechanics. Fewer options. Airfields became graveyards. Not because they were bombed once, catastrophically, but because they were bombed constantly, methodically. Craters were filled, only to be recratered. Aircraft that survived one strike were destroyed in the next, sometimes while still being repaired from the first. Pilots who managed to take off often had nowhere to land because the strips they'd launched from were rubble by the time they returned. And it wasn't just bombs. American planes strafed. They dropped napalm. They mined harbors. They destroyed bridges, depots, radio stations, and coastal batteries. Anything that could support Japanese operations was a target. And the strikes came so fast, so relentlessly, that the Japanese stopped trying to rebuild and started trying to survive. Transport hubs, the arteries that fed the far-flung island garrisons, were choked off. Cargo ships that once delivered food, ammunition, and reinforcements were sunk faster than they could be replaced. Islands that had been strategically vital became isolated, cut off, starving. Soldiers dug into caves and waited. Not for reinforcements. Not for victory. Just for the end. The sky had become hostile territory. Pilots who once flew with confidence now flew with dread, knowing that every sortie was likely their last. Not because they lacked courage, but because the math didn't allow for survival. One American plane could be shot down, and two more would take its place. One Japanese plane lost was gone. Irreplaceable. The consequences weren't just tactical. They were psychological. The Japanese had always believed they could endure. Could outlast. Could fight with spirit where the enemy had only material. But spirit doesn't dodge 500 bombs. And endurance has a breaking point. Admiral Mitchell said it quietly, almost to himself, while watching the flight deck at dusk. The last planes were landing. The deck crews were already prepping for tomorrow's launch. Fuel hoses coiled. Ordnance carts repositioned. The machine didn't stop. It just paused. They'll never catch their breath again. He was right. From mid-1944 onward, the Japanese Navy existed in a state of perpetual emergency. Every dawn brought a new crisis. Every morning, the question wasn't can we win today, but can we survive today? Operational breathing space, the time needed to regroup, repair, rethink, vanished. You can't strategize when you're suffocating. The Americans had discovered something the Japanese couldn't counter: hourly attrition. Most wars are fought in campaigns. Weeks of build-up, a major battle, weeks of recovery. But this war had become continuous. The Americans didn't need to win one big fight. They just needed to win every morning. And they did. Over and over. Until the cumulative weight of all those mornings crushed the Japanese ability to resist. It wasn't a war of maneuver anymore. It wasn't a war of tactics. It was a war of production. And when war becomes industrial, the side with factories wins. Always. Japanese admirals, the same men who'd planned Pearl Harbor, who dominated the Pacific in 1942, now sat in bunkers and read reports that made no sense. Entire air groups gone. Entire bases silenced. The numbers were impossible, except they were real. The Americans weren't just winning. They were accelerating. Building faster. Striking harder. Launching earlier. By the time the war ended, the Japanese Navy had been reduced to scattered remnants. Not because they'd lost one decisive battle, but because they'd lost 1,000 small ones. Every sunrise. Every strike. Every wave of Hellcats and Dauntless that appeared before the Japanese could even scramble a response. The admirals had built their strategy on a dangerous assumption, that America was slow. That it could be surprised. That it needed time. They were wrong. And the sky taught them that lesson. Every single morning.